As I mentioned last week, there are times you come out of a parasha and you realize that there was something there that you wanted to be omed on, and you just didn't get the opportunity until the parasha is gone. So lucky for us, we come together twice a week. So like this, I still have Monday night to be able to catch something from the previous parasha, and I'll prove it to you, because we know the halacha is, if chas v'shalom, somebody for some reason doesn't make havdalah mosaic Shabbat, they can still make it until Tuesday. So I'm still making havdalah on last week's parasha of Toldot, and I'm still trying to catch the last wave of an idea, nekudah, that I think is something unbelievable. Be'emet unbelievable. And then Mezat Hashem, when we're back Wednesday night together, if Mashiach doesn't come, we'll be able to try to find that first step into the coming week, parasha as well. Rabotai, I think it's amazing. One of the greatest moments that everyone looks forward to read, that amazing moment of the Birkat Yitzchak Avinu, where here, Assaf, Yaakov Avinu, comes for the greatest berachot of history. These are the greatest berachot of all time. And at this moment, we take a look and we listen. Yitzchak Avinu says, he turns to Assaf, and he says to Assaf, Ve'ata, sana chelecha v'telcha v'kashtecha. It's time for me to bless you. I'm getting old. So go grab your bow, your arrow. Go out, and catch me a catch. Va'aseli mat'amim ka'asher ahavti. And make me mat'amim, a delicious meal, the way I love it. Psh, do you hear that? Ka'asher ahavti. Make me a steak the way I love it. Medium well, with some garnishings on the side, some little fried onions on top, with a side of fries. Kasher ahavti, the way I love it. What's going on here? I'm talking here, Yitzchak Avinu. Yitzchak Avinu, Rabotai, you have to understand. He was so kadosh that he could not leave Eretz Yisrael. When there was a Ra'av, Ma'aseh Avot, Siman Labanim, he wanted to do what his father did. So he actually entertained the idea to go down to Mitzrayim, and Borei Olam told him, no. You are Korban Olah. You were brought up on a Mizbeach. You're Kodesh Lashem. You can't leave Eretz Yisrael even if you wanted to. And therefore he went down to Avimelech instead. Because you, Yitzchak, you're Kodesh Lashem. We're talking about Yitzchak Avinu that was beyond this world. Do you really think that when Yitzchak Avinu turns to Assaf, he's ordering up a steak? Do you really think when he told him, Ka'asher ahavti, it's Yitzchak Avinu who is in for, down for a big meal? Like the way I loved it last time you made it? You think that Yitzchak Avinu is the one who's indulging in food, in Olam Hazeh? Yitzchak Avinu was beyond our imagination. We could never humanize him. He was beyond anything that you can picture, and then some. And yet, he turns to Assaf, and he asks him, go out and catch me a catch, and make me that steak, ka'asher ahavti. What's pshat? Yitzchak Avinu is not into food. I see that you guys aren't feeling the emotion that I want to give over. The words you hear. So I'm going to give it to you now between the eyes. Could you imagine? Somebody comes to Reb Chaim Kanievsky Shalita in Bnei Brak. And he says, Harav, please, I came all the way from America. Give me a biracha. And Reb Chaim looks at the guy and says to him, you want me to give you a biracha? I want you to go out to the gas station on the way out from Bnei Brak, the famous gas station, Halot Teman, with the famous shawarma over there, and pick me up, Ka'asher Ahavti. Get me the shawarma the way I like it, in a lafa. And I want it with hummus, and make sure it's all meat and chips. And make it for me, wrap it for me, and tell the guy not to chincha on the chips, but to give good, a maneh shalem. And if you bring me back, ka'asher ahavti, the way that I love that shawarma, then ki'im berachtani. Then I'm going to give you a berachah. You're joking me. If someone would tell you this, you'd laugh him out the window. Rabbi Chaim Kanievsky. Rabbi Chaim Kanievsky, when they told him about the fax machine, he didn't know what they were talking about. What are you talking about? What are you saying? If you ever read the story of the books, and Rebbe Kanievsky in the book, and she talks about, the different stuff that they had in the kitchen, whatever it was, a toaster. She said, Rabbi Chaim didn't know how to, this is not for him. He's beyond this world. He's the Sar HaTorah. You know what I mean, Sar HaTorah? He's Kol Kulo Torah. He's a walking Shas. He's a walking Bavli. He's a walking Yerushalmi. He's a walking Sefer Torah. This world is nothing to him. And this is someone from our generation, Gadol Ador. We're talking here about the Avot HaKdoshim. Yitzchak Avinu. Gvura. He's on the Kisei HaKavod. He's an Olah Korban Lashem. And you think he's asking to indulge in food? Ka'asher ahavti, get me a good steak the way I like it, and make it the way I like it? Come on. What's pshat in this pasuk bichlal? And Rabotai, once we're asking these questions, we know what ends up happening. We spoke extensively last week on this parasha, and this amazing moment of the berachot of Yaakov and Assaf, and how they were two halves of a whole. We went through that whole shmooze last week. And here's the moment of truth. Yaakov Avinu walks in with the clothing of Assaf, as we spoke last week. And sure enough, Yitzchak Avinu says, Kshana Elai, come over here. I want to feel you. Something's funny. Hakol kol Yaakov, ha'yadayim yidei Assaf. Something's funny, something's up. But then listen to this, Rabotai. Amazing. Vayigash Yaakov el Yitzchak Aviv vayimusheu. He feels it. Hakol kol Yaakov ha'yadayim yidei Assaf. Unbelievable. And then what does he say? Listen to this. Vayigash vayishaklo. He kissed him. Vayarach et reach bigadav vayivarcheu. He smelled the smell of the clothing that Yaakov was wearing, and he blessed him. Vayomer re'eh reach beni kereach hasada shebercho Hashem. The smell of your clothing, my son, is the smell of Ganeden. Yitzchak, you know whose clothing he's wearing? He's wearing the clothing of a Rasha. He's wearing the clothing of Assaf. Whose clothing was he wearing? He came in with whose clothing? Assaf. Okay. But Lamaisa, he was wearing the clothing of Assaf. That's what his mother gave him. You're right. I'm not saying you're wrong. But now these are the clothing of Assaf. The clothing that the Rasha wore and did all types of wonderful things with. Let's just leave it at that. If you remember what the Rashi said that day, on last week's parasha, when he came in from the Sadeh, and he was wearing the famous jacket, the clothing, that he ended up killing Nimrod for. What did he do that day upon hearing the death of Abraham Avinu? He did all three averot chamurot. He ended up being mevazeh the bechor. He was over 5 averot. I mean, he took those clothing for a ride. Those are the clothing that you smell Ganeden on. You know whose clothing those are? Those are the clothing of Assaf that Yaakov is wearing. And he smells the clothing. Geschmack. From the clothing, I can smell the Reach HaSadeh. I can smell, I can smell Gan Eden. That's the clothing of Assaf. Rasha's clothing, you smell Gan Eden? There's something funny here. Something funny. There's something funny with the Yachas between Yitzchak Avinu and Assaf. Which the truth of the matter is, we knew this all along. Because already in the get-go of the parasha, Vayehav Yitzchak et Assaf, ki tzayid befiv. Yitzchak loved Assaf. There was something interesting about this connection, this relationship between Yitzchak and Assaf. And it gets even more wild when you go weiter in the parasha and you see that he tells him, bring me the food kasher ahavti. Suddenly Yitzchak Avinu, Ola Kodesh Lashem, is into food. He smells the begadim of Assaf, the smell of Gan Eden. What are we missing? We're missing something. We're missing something. Over the years, we said many different pshatim. One pshat we had that Be'emet Yitzchak knew who Assaf was. He knew he was a Rasha Merusha, but he was being makar of him. Because later on, when it's going to come time for Klal Yisrael to have Rachmanut from Shamayim, Yitzchak Avinu could say, wait one second, my child, Rasha, and I dealt with him and I didn't throw him out of the house. Borei Olam, you're no less than me, Chas v'Shalom. Your children are giving you troubles also. At least handle with them and the Rachmanut. The way I dealt with Assaf, I never threw my son out of the house. You don't throw your kids out either. Wow. Oh. Avraham lo yadanu. Ata Avinu. You know what we're referring to that? Yitzchak Avinu. Beautiful pshat. We said this years ago on a beautiful mahalach, on a different share, of how people today in our door should realize that the avodah, bringing up children today, is an avodah. And it's an avodah of mercy. It's an avodah of absolute, unadulterated love. It's an avodah. But that's not what we're coming here to tell you tonight. Tonight we want to go with a mahalach of the great Rebbe Tzadok Hakohen. I heard this mahalach from my dear Yedid Nafshi, Rabbi Gladstein. Hashem should bless him. I'd like to try to give it over to you. It's an eye-opener to try to drive home the side that Yitzchak Avinu believed that Assaf was a tzaddik. Yeah, listen to this mahalach. It's a new one. We've never did this before. This is Chadash. Says Reb Tzadok Hakohen, Yadua, we all remember the Gemara in Masechet Berachot. And the Medrash brings this as well. Rabban Gamliel was known that he spent his entire life doing amazing kibud avayim for his father. He took care of his father his entire life. Rabban Gamliel came from royalty. He came from David HaMelech. But Rabban Gamliel spent his life kibud avayim, taking care of his father in an amazing way. Said Rabban Gamliel, I spent my life taking care of my father, kibud avayim. And I didn't come to not 1/100th of the kibud avayim of Assaf. Wow, that's unbelievable. Do you hear that? Rabban Gamliel, Nasi, from Zera David, he's telling you he spent his life taking care of his father. Not 1/100th of the kibud avayim of Assaf. Says the Gemara, Assaf surpassed Yaakov Avinu in one mitzvah, in one area. And that was the area of kibud avayim. There was no one bigger when it came to kibud avayim than Assaf. I want to tell you for a moment the logic, a svara to this. What was Assaf so infatuated about his father? Because Assaf was all about this world. He was all about olam hazeh. Who brings you into this world? Your father. So he had such an appreciation that his father brought him to Olam Hazeh, because he is Mr. Olam Hazeh. He's Ish Sadeh. He's the guy that's all about this world. Abba, you brought me into this world. Because to you I can enjoy this world. And if that's the case, Assaf loved his father. You see what's going on? Assaf loved his father. He loved him unbelievable because of that. I just want to mention something that I think is an amazing quip. Yaakov Avinu was all about Olam Haba. Your father brings you into Olam Hazeh. Your Rebbe brings you into Olam Haba. And that's the reason why the kavod for a Rebbe is greater than the kavod for a father, as the Rambam paskins. I heard once Rabbi Gladstein say something incredible. He says, without your father, you cannot come into Olam Hazeh. And without your Rebbe, you can't come into Olam Haba. Wow, that's powerful. There are a lot of people that are self-taught, that they learned from Svarim, they learned from books, but they didn't get the Messiah from a Rebbe. It's interesting. Without a father, you can't come into Olam Hazeh. Without a Rebbe, you cannot come into Olam Haba. Who's your Rebbe? Not Stam. Big idea. Assaf loved his father. You brought me into Olam Hazeh. You were the one that gave me the opportunity to have the world that he died for. He loved it. And because of that, Assaf was the quintessential master of kibura v'em. No one was able to do the level. Rabban Gamliel, 1/100th, 1/100th, he says on himself, of Assaf. No one was able to come to Assaf's kibura v'em. He did the mitzvah b'shlemuta, to the greatest degree. The Gemara writes, the Medrash says, he would put on a special suit and special clothing to come and serve his father. He would dress up in his Shabbat clothing, so to speak, to come and serve his father. He put on a tuxedo to come and serve his father. And he would give him the best of the best and the best of the matamim. And he would serve his father with such unbelievable love and warmth, and he would feed him. Tzayid b'fiv. Chazal says he actually put the food in his mouth. He actually put it in his mouth. We're talking about beyond VIP service. Assaf. His kibura v'em was beyond this world. It came to a point where Yitzchak Avinu, he saw Assaf and his amazing ability for kibura v'em, that the very food that he was serving at the time of the kibura v'em was imbued with the ta'am of the mitzvah itself. The food was a shtik kibura v'em. The clothing was a shtik kibura v'em. The food was imbued with the ta'am of the mitzvah. You were able to taste the kibura v'em in the food because it was done out of such an unbelievable level. The clothing was smelling from the mitzvah of kibura v'em. Literally, the smell of Ganeden was on his clothing. At the time that he served his father, he literally was a part of the actual mitzvah itself. And therefore, says Yitzchak Avinu, you want me to give you beracha? You bring me that food. Ka'asher ahavti. It's not the physical food that Yitzchak wanted. It had nothing to do with steaks, and it had nothing to do with fries. It was the absolute smell of the clothing of mitzvah and the food that was imbued with the ta'am of the mitzvah that was performed in the highest level, in the greatest of ways. That spiritual smell, that vibe that the food had, bring that to me, kasher ahavti. That will put me in a realm of olamot elyonim that I'll be able to give you the birachot of Yiten Lecha Elokim, Mital HaShamayim Mishmanei Haaretz, Rov Dagan V'Tirosh. The greatest celestial blessings will be able to be given through the kibud avayim of your food. And sure enough, what was the ticker when Yitzchak Avinu was testing to see when Yaakov comes in with the clothing of Esav? What was that sealed the deal that Yitzchak felt, oh, actually it might be Taka Esav, according to this pshat of Reb Tzadok? He smelled the begadav. Nobody has that smell on the begadim other than my Esav. Other than my Esav, nobody has that smell on their clothing. No one can do kibur avayim like him. No one can have in the clothing a shtik kibur avayim reyach. That's the reyach hasadeh of Ganeden. It's the reyach of the mitzvah. It's the smell of the mitzvah. It's the power in the food of the mitzvah. Ka'asher ahavti, I smelled your clothing, I smelled the reyach hasadeh. Amazing. And this is going to explain now something that's Yitzchak Avinu, says Reb Tzadok, when Esav came to do the mitzvah of kibud avayim, that was the one encounter he had with his son. That was the only encounter. Says Reb Tzadok something very high. But we're going to simplify. He says when a person does a mitzvah in a very passionate way, there's an or hamakif that comes off the mitzvah and envelopes the person and illuminates the person to such an or gadol that for a moment the orot of Gan Eden comes down to this world on this person. It is a Gan Eden experience, but tachton, in this world. Do you get what I'm saying? By doing the mitzvah so passionately, the mitzvah gives off such an or that it's an or hamakif. It envelopes the person and surrounds the person in, so to speak, an orot of mini Gan Eden down in this world at the time that he did the mitzvah. If this is the case, you understand now the missing link between the yachas of Yitzchak and Esav, and why he believed that Esav be'emet was a tzaddik. Because every encounter Yitzchak had with Esav was a kibud avayim encounter. Every time he came in front of his father, it was to serve him. So here Esav puts on his best clothing. He goes out and gets his best food. He comes in now to do kibud avayim on the highest level. At that moment, the light of the mitzvah envelopes him, or hamakif. He literally now brings down a certain Gan Eden, hatachton, in this world. And he walks into his father illuminated. What does his father see in front of him? A malach. A Gan Edennik in this world. He says, that's my son Esav. That's my Bechor. That's my boy. That's my son Esav. That's my son Esav. It's unbelievable. And because of that, every encounter, Yitzchak, according to this pshat, actually felt that Esav was something out of this world. I want to tell you where this is coming from. Something maybe that we could touch upon and digest this great idea from the great Reb Tzadok Hakohen. I'm sure everybody here heard of the Chozeh Milublin. Why was he called Jack the Chozeh Milublin? Chozeh, milashon, that he was able to see from one side of the world to the other side. Baruch HaKodesh, the Chozeh Milublin. He was able to see beyond this world. Chozeh, he can see. He's the, what we call in English, he's a seer. He can see beyond. The Chozeh Lublin was once approached by the people of Lublin, and they said, Rebbe, we have a problem. There's a Yid here in town, and he's a moser. And he's constantly telling on Jews to the Goyim and getting them in trouble. We all know the halacha. Moser is chayamita. Chayamita. They turned to the Choseh and they said, Rebbe, here's his name. This is who the guy is. We want you to look at him and finish him. Just take one look at him and finish him. He's chayamita. The Choseh takes the name and he says, tonight when I sit down to learn, I'm going to be Mevar Danian. That night late, as he's learning, he pulls out the name and he looks at the name of the Moiser of this mensch. This Jew, this non-religious Jew telling on Jews. And as he's looking at the name, he can't believe it. The Choseh Milublin, he gives a shudder. And he says, this guy's a Moser? This guy's a Rasha? I see that he's a Tzaddik. I see that he's a Kadosh. I see that he's something from the Tzaddikim of the city. They want me to kill this guy? He's the Rasha? He looks at the name. He looks at him with his Heilige eyes. He looks at him. He says, he's a Tzaddik. What are you talking about? The next morning, the people come to the Choseh and says, he's still alive. What happened? Why don't you finish him last night? The Choseh tells him, you told me he's a Rasha. When I looked at him last night, he was one of the tzaddikim of the city. He's a tzaddik. What did you bring me? Has v'shalom. To even hurt a person like this. He's a tzaddik, a kadosh. He said, what, Rebbe? What are you talking about? This guy's a moser. He's a Rasha. Mitbarer hadavar. That they tracked down to the exact moment in time, the night before, that the Choseh finished learning and looked at the guy's name and looked at the guy in order to go finish him off. And they tracked down that at that very minute, this guy, the Moser, was lighting Chanukah menorah. And the Or HaMakif, the Or Gadol of the mitzvah was Mekif, this guy, and he was shining. He was illuminated. He was shining like a tzaddik gomor. He was in a Ganeden atachton, machmat orot. But what do you mean? The guy's a meiser. It's chayamita, is a Rasha. Yeah, but for that moment that he was in the middle of doing the mitzvah of Chanukah menorah, at that moment, the Or HaGadol was Mekif. And at that moment, he illuminated like a tzaddik gomor. And that was the moment that the Choseh looked at him. Chas v'shalom, to touch such a man, she's tzaddik ha'ir. So Yitzchak Avinu, the only encounters he had with his son Assaf was on the highest levels of kibura va'em service. At that moment he walked in with the Or HaGadol, the Or HaMekif of kibura va'em, and he was illuminated like the sun. He was illuminated, he was on fire. He saw Ganeden on his son. He saw the light of Kedusha on his son. He's the prince of kibura va'em. And because of that, because of the way he served him, the way he put the food in his mouth, the kibud ava'em that illuminated him at the time of his service, which at that moment even the biggest Rasha comes off as a tzaddik in Ganeden. It is unbelievable. This idea is an unbelievable idea. So his begadim smell like Ganeden, and his food has the shmek of Ganeden, kasher ahavti. It's unbelievable. What's going on? And if this is the case, I have a new mahalach. I thought to myself, maybe this was the secret. You know, the pasuk, the Ma'amar Chazal tells us, Ki ner mitzvah v'torah or. The light of a mitzvah that we've been talking about till now, we're talking about kibura, we're talking about Chanukah menorah, is the light of kiner mitzvah. The light of a mitzvah is like the light of a candle in comparison to the light of the Torah. The Torah, or the light of Torah, is like the light of the sun. Could you bichlal compare the light of a candle to the light of the sun? Would you ever try to hold the candle up in front of the sun? It's completely insignificant in comparison to the awesome light of the sun. If we're talking here, Reb Tzadok Hakohen, about the light of a mitzvah of kibura, the light of the mitzvah of Chanukah, and such a light of a mitzvah, which is compared to a candlelight, is able to be makif a person and envelope him in such an illuminating way that Yitzchak would actually think Assaf is a tzaddik, and the Chozeh Milublin would actually see on a moser that he's from the Tzadikei Ha'ir. Could you imagine the light of Torah? Could you imagine when a guy sits down to learn a blat Gemara? Could you imagine when a guy schwitzes over a Tosafot, he breaks his head on a Rashba? Could you imagine the light that comes over that person at that time? The Or Bakif of Torah is the sun compared to the mitzvot of a ner. And if a ner can make you look illuminated in Ganeden, what could the light of Torah that's compared to the sun make you illuminated like? Can you imagine what we get on a blat Gemara? What type of light we start our day when we go to a daf yomi in the morning and we walk into the day with a daf and we're illuminated with the light of the sun, not the light of the candle. Can you imagine a guy who sits and learns an hour or two extra in the morning? And he sits down. We have a seder here in the morning, right here in the shul. Reb Chesky's with me. 8:45, we finish davening after the 7 o'clock seder. We have a second seder. It's a morning kollel. 8:45, we do the Yorucha, Hilchot Maaser, Hilchot Tzedakah Be'iyun. And then we do the Bet HaLevi Be'iyun. And then we do Shmirat HaLashon. It's like a little kollel we got going here until 10 o'clock in the morning with these guys. And they don't want to leave. Why? Because sometimes you can feel the light. There's such an or from Torah that's mekif a person, that you're shining now like the sun. I believe that the choshech of galut is the lacking of understanding the light of Torah. What do you think about that? Try that one on for size. The real choshech is the idea of the or of Torah today. If we would know what the light of Torah is to the person learning, especially at the time they're learning, that they are surrounded and enveloped in a blinding light beyond the light of Ganeden. Light of Ganeden comes from a mitzvah that's compared to a candle. I'm talking about the light that's compared to the sun, the Torah light. Could you imagine the light that's on a person at that time? That's mekif the person, that's miromem the person, that at that minute when Hashem looks at the guy while he's learning, he sees a tzaddik gamor, with a blinding light. That's galut, that we don't have a clue on the light that's on us at the time we learn Torah. It's choshech biyidi'ah. Mefashtei nisht. We don't get it. If we would get it, Rabotai, I want to tell you something. If we had the right eyeglasses on, if we would be able to clean the eyes out from the choshech of galut and actually see things in real time of the way it truly is be'emet, where we would actually see the light coming upon us and enveloping us and illuminating us at the time we're learning and schwitzing over a blat Gemara, we would never leave. We'd never leave. Who would break the electricity on such a light? Who? Who would stop that energy from coming to him? No wonder the Torah is machkim peti. No wonder the Torah is yishuv hadat, mesamche lev. It brings a simcha because it puts you in Ganeden. It puts you in Ganeden. You're enveloped in a meshunadika light at the time of the learning when nothing else matters. A guy that's really learning, he doesn't look at the time. He doesn't know the people that walked into the room, walked out of the room. He's in a Welt of his own. Literally this time. Literally. He's literally someplace else. He transported himself somewhere else. He's enveloped in this amazing light, and he's in a Gan Eden beyond our grasp. We can't fathom what we're talking about here. If we would only be able to see what we have, but we can't because of Galut. But that doesn't mean it's not there. That doesn't mean it's not there. That's where we go back to the Emunah. To believe that something's there even though I can't see it. To believe that there's an Eibishter. Emunah. Bitachon, to rely on him even though I don't see him. To believe that there's an or makif, an or gadol, that comes around a person that's blinding at the time he's learning a piece of Gemara, at the time that he goes and does a mitzvah, even though I don't see it, because I'm in a choshech. It's not that it's not there. But there's a filter, there's a galut, there's a choshech that's blocking you from seeing the real reality. But it's there. Believe it's there even though you don't see it. That's not hard to ask a Jew. We already do that. We believe in ruchnius, in ruchaniyut. We believe it's there even though we don't see it. We believe in Borei Olam even though we don't see it. We believe in Kiddusha even though we don't see it. Believe in the Or HaMakif. It's an unbelievable idea. Now I'm going to tell you a pshat. You remember the famous Gemara on Shabbat Daf Lamed of David HaMelech? David HaMelech tells Hashem, Hodiani Kitzi, tell me the day I'm going to pass away. Hashem says, I don't tell anyone the day they pass away. Till finally David asks and begs and asks and begs, and he finally is told at least the day of the week. And Borei Olam tells him, Shabbat. And from that day on, what does David HaMelech do? Every single Shabbat, he learns Torah the entire Shabbat. Until the end of Shabbat, he beats the system again and again and again. That's why the Sfaradim, they have that minhag that when they do Havdalah, and they make Borei Priya Geffen on Havdalah, everyone goes, ha 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 ha, they're laughing. Where did it? So they'll tell you, some people will tell you, it's to start the week on a happy note. It's a nice thing, you know. It's a nice thing. There is such a concept to that. There is. But really, David HaMelech, at the end of every Shabbat, when he made Havdalah, he laughed. Ha ha! I beat the system. The Malach HaMavet couldn't touch me another Shabbat. I learned Torah the entire Shabbat. Why not? So I always understood that the Malach HaMavet could not touch David HaMelech at the time he's learning Torah for the simple reason that the Zechut HaTorah is magne umatzle, like the famous Gemara, right? The Torah protects. It's like a shield. Magne umatzle. But tonight I want to tell you, what is the shield? Oh, it's a force field. It's an or gadol, an or makif, an or ganuz that comes around a person and literally envelopes them to the extent of such an illuminated Gan Eden in this world while the guy's learning a Blat Gemara that at that moment he's untouchable. He's immortal. He's immortal. He's immortal. Not even Baal Chamavet can break through that incredible Or HaMakif. And therefore, Kozman David was learning, couldn't touch him. And that's why Reb Tzadok Hakohen writes, if a person is in the street, as an example, And the Yetzer Hara comes to him to do an Avera. Right? Im pagashta oto minuval, the famous Gemara in Kiddushin. Right? If you bump into oto minuval, if you bump into the Yetzer Hara on the street, and he's coming, he's pushing you to do an Avera. So the Gemara says, Mashkeu lebet HaMidrash, bring him in to learn. Reb Tzadok Hakohen says, let me tell you the pshat. What does it mean, bring him in to learn? It doesn't have to be necessarily the Bet Midrash. Says Reb Tzadok, listen to this. He says, if you want to save yourself from doing Averot, at the moment that it's knocking on your door, at the moment that the Yetzer Hara is testing you, instead of trying to push him out of your mind, instead of trying to avoid him, instead of trying to change the subject, instead of talking to yourself saying, no, I'm not going to think of that, no, I'm not going to look at that. He says, do something much better, much more effective. Quickly, do a mitzvah. Quickly do a mitzvah. Or quickly say over Dvar Torah. And suddenly, the minute you do the mitzvah, the Orah Makif surrounds you, and he can't come near you. You hear this? Say over a Dvar Torah. Prepare a Mishnah that you know by heart. For any time that the guy enters a certain Nisayon, and he starts to get weakened, close your eyes. Nachama, let me chazer the Mishnah right here. Shnayim ochazim b'talit. Zeh omer ani mitzatia. Zeh omer ani mitzatia. Zeh omer kuler sheli. Zeh omer kuler sheli. He can't touch you. It was like, the force field comes up. He's untouchable. Tzadok Hakohen. You don't know what this Or Makif is. Chaval, we're in a choshech of galut, that we can't see what's really there. Chaval. If we'd be able to see it, wow, we wouldn't leave it. We wouldn't leave it. We would walk around with kotnot or, with an aleph. We'd walk around with illuminated clothing, with an aleph, not or leather, no, with an aleph. Kotnot or, illuminated clothing. That's the Orah Makif of mitzvot. That's the Or Hagadol of Torah. Unbelievable. My brother called me from Montreal this past week, and he tells me, Duvi, I have a story for you. It goes to show you something. Everybody thinks we have 4 brothers. There's really 5 brothers. There's one brother that we tucked away in Montreal, and we are keeping him under the radar. Nobody to hear or know about the guy. Let him learn. He's a Rosh Kollel out there in Montreal. Let him learn. He's the youngest brother from the pack. Out of the public. This brother, proving that he's also a Ben Shushan, calls me up. I have a story. See, it's it's in the dam. He calls me up and he says, I have a story. He said, Duvi, I want you to hear this. He says, this Maisa just happened this past week with a family member of his. He says, the Vishnitzer Kollel came collecting by a family member of my brother through marriage. And they sit and they were talking to the Balabos, and they were telling him how many Avrechim and how much learning is going on with Hatmada, how many Masechtot they finished. This is a real Kollel, and they're collecting to be able to support the Kollel. 2 gentlemen come in to collect. So the Balabayit, he says, okay, I always help the Vishnitzer Kollel. I'm close with the Vishnitzer Rebbe in Eretz Yisrael. He pulls out a check, and he starts writing out a nice check to give to the Kollel. As he's writing out the check, talking to the younger man from the Kollel, the guy sitting next to him, the other Vishnitzer Chassid, didn't look like a guy in Kollel. So he turns to the other guy and says, are you also in the Kollel? And the second guy says, no, I'm not. He says, you're not. So, are you the administrator of the Kollel? No, I'm not. Are you the fundraiser of the Kollel? Man, that's why you're here. He says, no, I'm not. He says, do you have anything to do with the Kollel? He says, no. He says, well, why are you here? He says, it's funny you ask. He said that he was diagnosed with a very serious stage of cancer, and the doctors did not think he had a chance to live. They gave him a few days. He went to the Vizhnitzer Rebbe, and he told him his situation, and the Rebbe told him, when the Avreichim of the Kollel go around to collect money for the Torah of the Kollel, you go with them from house to house. And the schus of the Torah of Hachzakat Torah will envelope you, and you will not be touched. He says, I've been doing this already for 6 months. I was supposed to be gone 5 months and 23 days ago. And I'm still going strong. Baruch Hashem, healthy. Baruch Hashem, walking around from house to house, collecting for the Vizhnitzer Kollel with this younger man. I have nothing to do with the Kollel. I'm not the fundraiser. I'm not the director. But I'm going around, collecting, helping to collect for the Torah of the Kollel, so that the Or HaGadol Hazeh could be Mekif a mensch, and literally can envelope him and put him in a different place. That's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. Rabotai, if we would only know what that moment would do to us, Be'ezat Hashem, we would never stop learning. Says Yitzchak Avinu, your bigadim will smell like Ganeden. Your food will be food that will be domeh lekorbanot, because it's imbued with the mitzvot, with the Torah that the mensch does. If it worked for Assaf, I guarantee you, it'll work for every single one of us. Thank you for listening.